Yes, this video is about pigeons. And I know you're probably already like, yeah, whatever, it's a pigeon. It's the most boring animal on the planet. Why would I make an entire video talking about them? And you do have a point, because, come on, they're everywhere, they're on every sidewalk, every park bench, and every statue that some poor city worker has to clean. And if I'm being honest here, nothing about this bird screams, pay attention to me. But I'm telling you right now that you need to brace yourself for what you're about to learn from this video, because the animal that you've been calling a rat with wings is an actual genius. Not genius as in, oh, it's smarter than other birds. No, it's an actual genius by almost any measure of cognitive ability scientists have applied to it. And the disrespect the pigeon gets is so out of proportion to what it actually is that it's become one of the most embarrassing mischaracterizations in human history. And in the title of this video, I said that I could prove it, so let's prove it. Alright, so the first form of proof that I have is the way they find their way home. Now, some people kinda know what they can do, but as far as understanding how they do it, their knowledge is more like, oh yeah, pigeons, they fly home, cool. And then they just move on without actually thinking about what that means or how insane it actually is. Like, we're talking about a bird that uses multiple different forms of navigation systems. Now, what are those systems, you ask? Well, the first one is the sun. And I don't mean that it just points towards the sun and be like, oh, this means home. No, it's accounting for the fact that the sun moves throughout the day. It basically has this internal clock running in the background that constantly tracks time and adjusts for solar position at the same time, which means that the pigeon is actually doing navigation math in real time. And don't worry, navigation math is when you apply mathematical principles like geometry, trigonometry, and vectors to determine position, direction, and distance while traveling. And apart from the whole math thing, they can also navigate by using visual landmarks like a road or a building. It's sort of like how you stop needing a GPS once you recognize the neighborhood you're in. They can also navigate by using their sense of smell, by building up these olfactory maps of their environment over time, and then match those scents with certain locations. And on top of that, they can also navigate by using the Earth's magnetic field. They can do this because they have specialized cells called superparamagnetic macrophages that's located in their liver. But this form of navigation is more or less reserved for cloudy days when the sun isn't there for them to use. So that means you have a bird running 4 completely different navigation systems simultaneously, cross-referencing them, switching between them when one goes down, and producing this insanely reliable ability to get home from anywhere. Which sounds like an exaggeration, but it's just what pigeons do. But okay, let's say that you're the kind of person that doesn't care about how they navigate, because you're more of a cold, hard neuroscience type of person. Fine. In 2011, researchers at the University of Otago published a study in the journal Science showing that pigeons can learn abstract numerical rules and apply them to sequences that they've never encountered before, like counting, ordering sets by quantity, understanding that 5 is more than 3 and less than 7, even when they've never seen those specific groupings before. And up until that study, that kind of abstract numerical reasoning was thought to be exclusive to primates. But pigeons just did it. And the researchers, and I want to be specific here because the wording matters, described the pigeon's performance as indistinguishable from that of rhesus monkeys. But then, the same researcher, Dr. Damien Scarf, came back in 2016 with a different study that showed that pigeons can distinguish real written words from non-words. Like, they could look at a sequence of letters on a screen and identify whether it was an actual English word or just some random letters jumbled together. Not because they memorized specific words, but because they picked up on the underlying patterns and structures of how words are built, which researchers call orthographic processing. That's the same visual system we use when we read, by the way. And on some specific tests, particularly ones involving transposed letters, like distinguishing door from dayor, the best performing pigeons actually did better than baboons that had been tested on the same task. The researchers wrote, and I quote, that the pigeon's performance is actually more comparable to that of literate humans than the baboon's performance. And then there's the cancer thing. With this one, pigeons were trained to look at breast cancer biopsy images and identify whether or not the samples were benign or malignant. And individual birds, after about 2 weeks of training, were hitting around 85% accuracy. And then, when the answers of multiple pigeons were combined using something called the flock sourcing approach, which is basically when you take the most common answer from the group to get your answer, the accuracy went up to 99%, which is what you'd expect from an experienced pathologist. Now, of course, nobody's using pigeons to diagnose breast cancer, but it does show you that these birds are capable of doing some incredible things. And look, while we're on the subject of what these birds notice about us specifically, researchers in Paris did an experiment where 2 scientists of similar build, age, and skin color wore different colored lab coats and went to a park and interacted with a group of wild, untrained pigeons. Now, in this experiment, one researcher fed the birds and left them alone, while the other one was hostile. And then, in following sessions when neither researcher was hostile anymore, the pigeons continued to avoid the one who had originally been hostile, even when 90% of their bodies were covered by clothing that had been switched. Meaning that wild pigeons that had never been trained to remember human faces recognized them by their faces and held on to that information. And the researcher's name who's on the study, Dr. Dalila Beauvais from the University of Paris, noted that the pigeons had spontaneously identified facial features as the most relevant characteristic to remember, rather than the color of the clothing that covered most of each person's body. So if you've ever been mean to a pigeon, there's a real scientific basis for the idea that it remembered you. But through all of this, right, through all the peer-reviewed studies showing that they can count like a monkey and read like a baboon and diagnose cancer like a doctor and recognize your face without being taught, the pigeon has received exactly 0 of the credit that it's owed. But the pigeon doesn't really need it, because it's out there doing things that should change how you think about what intelligence looks like when it shows up in a body that isn't human.